So I think just to kick off, the Frankfurt School is a much discussed but semi-confusing thing. We will be talking a little bit later about some of the various misconceptions and misinformation that kind of constantly circulates about the Frankfurt School. But since you two are both literal scholars of the Frankfurt School, I think it does make sense to begin with kind of some basic definitional questions. So Ben, maybe if you want to start by just briefly explaining what the Frankfurt School is, what critical theory is, and then Jeremy, if you want to jump in and discuss why you guys chose to focus specifically on Marcuse in your Catalyst piece, and what the main argument of One-Dimensional Man is.
So the Frankfurt School is a cluster of different thinkers that formed together in the interwar period in Germany. This is, some of the names that we might associate with the Frankfurt School who are better known are Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, and the person we're going to be talking about today, Herbert Marcuse. They drew on a number of different disciplines, psychology, sociology, political science, economics, in order to kind of unearth some of the major contradictions in modern capitalism. Often studying culture, studying music, film, literature, as well as the kind of traditional sort of, social realm. And so I think, the legacy of the Frankfurt School in this country is very much with us today, particularly in the academy, in English departments, in interdisciplinary studies. And I know you're going to ask about this, Jen and Paul, but the sort of idea of quote unquote cultural Marxism, of Marxism as infecting the way that people on the left or even liberals think about culture, think about popular culture, and try to influence it. I think for many people that comes from the Frankfurt School's attempt to subject a lot of culture to Marxist analysis. And so I think, Frankfurt School, even though Frankfurt is in Germany, a lot of its influence is really, I think, most relevant here in the United States, particularly because these are all scholars who came to this country to flee fascism in the 1930s and 40s, which is, of course, a big part of that story as well. So Jeremy, maybe you can take it from there.
Yeah, I agree with everything Ben said. I mean, critical theory means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. I think, the Frankfurt School were the people who invented the term. And I think kind of the idea behind it was basically to formulate Marxist theory that could deal with all the things that had happened over the course of the early 20th century. So including the rise of fascism and kind of a mass-based authoritarian politics on the right, the kind of the creation of a kind of consumerist welfare state capitalism, and the seeming kind of dialing down of opposition in advanced capitalist countries, which we'll be talking about, I think, more today, and kind of a number of the phenomena that they took to say, a lot is changing in the world, and so Marxism needs to be sort of rethought as a historical philosophy, as a historical set of ideas that are meant to analyze the current reality. Enough had changed about capitalism, and of course, the rise of the USSR, and also the kind of failure of revolutions in the West to take hold in the advanced capitalist world. These things all required sort of a rethinking of Marxist categories, and so critical theory was their name for it. And originally, we should say also, the Institute for Social Research, was very closely tied even actually to the German labor movement. They originally housed the archives for a lot of the German labor movement, but they were very importantly, even though they were all Communist Party sympathizers in many ways, they were independent and, kept their independence from any particular political party. And because in part they felt like all of the existing political formations, whether they were social democratic or liberal or communist or Trotskyist or whatever, they all were kind of missing some essential part of what it would take to like move past kind of the impasses of the mid 20th century. So, so there's that. So the reason we, as Ben said, there's a lot of influential figures in this, people who've kind of risen to stardom, other people like Eric Fromm, who've kind of faded as well, or, you know, Leo Lowenthal, people who aren't well known, the Marxist economist Henrik Grossman. We chose Marcuse. In some ways, Adorno is maybe the person that academically people most refer to, and it certainly influenced my thinking and my ideas. But Marcuse was the one who was kind of most closely tied to politics throughout his career, really, from the very beginning, when he was much younger, when he was part of like a revolutionary soldiers council in Germany, to like his work as part of like the OSS intelligence division during World War II. There's this really cool volume. I'm forgetting the name off the top of my head, but it's something like Dispatches from the Critical Theory or something like that. And it's basically like several people associated with the Frankfurt School who were working with the US government and sort of both doing intelligence gathering on the Nazis, but also kind of trying to make the argument that the only way to really undermine fascism from returning in Germany would be to create democratic socialism in Germany. An argument they obviously didn't win, but whatever. So to that part of his politics, to then with the rise of the New Left becoming what was known as kind of like the guru of the New Left. And a number of Marcuse's texts were like super influential for young people and students and broadly movement people at the time, including Eros and Civilization, his kind of book on sexual liberation, and his Marriage of Marx and Freud. But probably the most influential was One-Dimensional Man. So we wanted to kind of, as part of a Catalyst series on radical classics, we wanted to like take a new, fresh look, ideally, at that book, see what was living, what was dead, what it might have to say to today's left, even as Marcuse sort of eclipsed in stardom, in part because he was so political. And so some of his biggest concerns seem to be in the rearview mirror. And, you know, as academia took up the Frankfurt School, they cared less about the much more directly political Marcuse.
So let's get into One-Dimensional Man. Can you both sort of lay out the basic argument and the kind of I guess the basic argument of One-Dimensional Man, and talk a little bit about why it was so influential for the New Left? You have a really striking paragraph in your essay where you talk about how students in Europe used to chant in '68, Marx, Mao, Marcuse. So what's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, so it's sort of surprising that students would be chanting Marx, Mao, Marcuse if anyone reads One-Dimensional Man. And if you're looking for it in a bookstore, this is what the original looks like. It's not a book that offers very hopeful conclusions to its readers. It seems somewhat counterintuitive that it would offer anything like a political inspiration to a generation of young people, as it did in the 1960s. So what's actually going on in the book? I think one of the main contentions in the book, one of the central problems that Marcuse is wrestling with, is what has happened to the kind of traditional sort of Marxist theory of history. What has happened to the working class in a context? This is post-World War II. He mostly wrote the book in the late 1950s. It's published in 1964. So in this world of, you know, affluence, prosperity, you know, in what he calls advanced industrial society, in the West, in Europe, in the United States, how is it that the traditional sources of opposition, right, to the status quo have been absorbed, have been rendered quiet, have been made quite happy with the way that things are? This is his understanding of that society. And he's basically outlining a way in which the welfare state, consumerism, the blandishments of the affluent society have absorbed the working class, have absorbed the great mass of people and legitimated the system in such a way that it's hard to imagine anything really challenging the way that things are. And so it's an analysis of ideology, but it's grounded in a materialist analysis of late capitalism or advanced industrial society, as we mention it in our piece. I think it's also important, though, to talk about the fact that the book ends with a kind of cryptic remark about the Great Refusal, that there's going to be some kind of death blow to the system, but it's not going to come from the working class. It's not going to come necessarily from the traditional source that we associate with, the end of capitalism or a challenge to existing capitalism. That in fact, there has to be some kind of rupture with the system, but at least it seems likely that under given conditions, the only place to look might be outside of it. And he talks about those at the bottom of the pyramid of society. He talks about outsiders, the alienated, the disaffected. And so part of what we're interested in is how the book sets off a search for new subjects of history, new groups that may be the revolutionary subject or revolutionary subjects, plural, outside of or separate from the working class. And Marcuse, I think, leaves a lot of room for his readers to take that interpretation and run with it. And what we're trying to understand is how he also, at the end of the day, is still a Marxist, is still a materialist who's very committed to a traditional, you might say, model of working class as the central agent of history. So he's kind of thinking both thoughts at once. And I don't think ultimately gives license to some of the reception of the book. Jeremy, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really right. I mean, even when he talks about the Great Refusal, he says like something it would be preparatory or a spark, and repeatedly in like interviews and other things, he says, well, I can't really imagine social change without the working class. And that's part of what we wanted to like take on in this essay was that, he and the Frankfurt School generally are treated as these kind of, you might say like cultural determinists or sort of people who are displacing kind of the role of the working class or materialist analysis or a number of other things in their approach to social change and their thinking. And we, I think a careful reading of the book, especially for people who are like conversant in the categories that Marcuse is like, trying to update in a sense, makes pretty clear that he's still operating from it, like an authentic sense of confusion, where there's sort of the idea, I mean, first of all, he shares with the kind of classic Marxist view that capitalist society, however stable it might look like in the present, is like in a very bad state, is not like needs to be overcome. And he gives, we tried to put in sort of boxes, sort of the three main aspects of his critique. Capitalist society is incredibly destructive and irrational. And, the book really focuses on the possibility of nuclear war throughout it, as well as environmental destruction and imperialist adventures. Also capitalism as a society of like manipulation and unfreedom. So people not having much at all freedom at their workplaces, people being, corporations still having a preponderant role in making real decisions about the economy and about society, democratic participation being kind of mostly a ruse and like an advertising campaign every 4 years, but not much substantial democratic participation from most people in the society. And also like the culture industry is playing a kind of role of manipulating people into, more or less sleeping through the kind of more urgent issues that they're faced with. And then finally, Marcuse accepts that capitalism is still also characterized by a great deal of exploitation and unfreedom, exploitation and poverty, exploitation in, sort of the full working class in terms of like that working weeks could be much shorter, that hours could be shorter, that people could work less hard. And also like extreme poverty in the form of African-American ghettos in big cities in the US or in Appalachia, the extreme poverty there, as well as like the relationship between the first and the third world. So he has like this big criticism that he shares with the Marxist tradition. And then he accepts the basic idea of social change from that tradition, which is that like you need, a working class majority has the capacity, it has the leverage, it has the, it's placed together in the places that might foment them to revolt, and they need to be organized in the form of parties. And when a capitalist crisis comes, then you're in a good place to, have a revolution and to transform society. The problem is he's basically like, yeah, this is still, as I see it, the only real path towards like substantive, fundamental social change. The problem is like, these things don't seem to be happening in the way they used to. And what Ben called absorption, his technical term is the theory of integration. And so the idea is like working class people have been integrated through a number of means. And, he says like we need to do a materialist analysis of this because the separation of working class life from radical consciousness is like growing. And it's a problem because radical consciousness means nothing without working class political change. But I don't really know, there's no real theory of how you'd reunite them, but there is at least a hypothesis about why it's happening, which includes like a rising standard of living, which makes people less likely to revolt because revolution happens when people are starving and less when they're not starving. It includes atomization through consumerism. The consumerism kind of pushes apart working class neighborhoods, working class culture that people increasingly individually consume and experience society. And this makes politics and organizing harder. And as well as the rise of white collar classes, sort of the rise of the middle classes who are less likely to be as deeply upset with the system. So all these things basically for Marcuse of a frozenness of opposition, a feeling that like what opposition there is in these supposed democratic societies is very narrow, is very self-contained, is frequently sort of commodified and just feeds right back into the system and, is not going anywhere. And there's this fundamental problem. And I think we wanted to give him a lot of credit for actually, unlike what some people think about the book, taking a really materialist approach to this problem and treating it as the fundamental problem. It honestly still is for the left, which is that the left ideas and the working class are still, even as the left is reviving, are still rather separate from one another.
And let's go back to the New Left for a second, because as you said, the New Left was heavily influenced by the Frankfurt School, by Marcuse. And I think for many new people coming to the left today, I think they look at the 1960s as like, these were the glory days of the US left. You had the civil rights movement, anti-war movement. There seemed to be action everywhere. It's known as an era of protest. And, some have said that this kind of new revived left today, whether you want to call it the Sanders left or the Jacobin left, is actually kind of trying to revive elements of the old left or the new old left, as we're called. So I guess, to break it down, what distinguished the new left from the old left, and why do you think we should still value the contributions and perspectives of that old left, and kind of where does the Frankfurt School fit into all of that? Sorry, that's big, but go ahead.
A big question.
Go ahead, Jeremy.
One thing I'd initially say is, sometimes this is like an overdrawn dichotomy. There's like, obviously someone like Marcuse came directly out of the old left, and, but also like, the idea that the civil rights movement was like not thinking about economic issues. And it's to some degree, the contrast is sometimes, well, the new left cared about things like democracy, it cared about racial equality, it cared about peace, it cared about a whole other set of values. And the old left was very, very focused on economic inequality and only economic inequality. And we talk about that a little bit in the piece. Like, I think it is to the new left's credit that it revived a kind of discussion of democracy, for instance, that had sort of fallen out a little bit in the tradition of politics. But that said, like, it's very clear that there was a socialist leadership of the civil rights movement. It's very clear, Maurice Esserman's book, If I Had a Hammer, is really good on the direct organizational connections between the old left and new left. Like the SDS was originally the Student League for Industrial Democracy, came out of the UAW, came out of the union movement. So, that it's a little overdrawn, but clearly this kind of sense that like material concerns were not moving people to action, and a new set of maybe wider moral concerns were going to move people to action, and maybe it would be new kinds of people, not the manual working class, industrial working class. That I think is fair, and certainly a difference in emphasis between New Left and Old Left.
Yeah, I mean, I would add to that. Well, first of all, I think that Maurice Isserman's book is a great book to actually scramble these stereotypes of old and new left and the hard distinction between them. But nonetheless, like those stereotypes have some basis in reality. The new left largely being, largely speaking, middle class, educated, and inspired by movements that don't originate in questions of economic exploitation and material deprivation first and foremost, or at least aren't legibly on the surface about that in the same way as the old left, right? In the sort of face of the Depression, being very much kind of shaped by the labor struggles of that decade, of the 1930s. But I think that Marcuse is, again, there's something very strange going on in his reception in the New Left. And we try to kind of show that in the piece, in that, as Jen said, Marx, Mao, Marcuse, these banners that people are carrying in Rome and in Berlin in the 60s, they seem to suggest that Marcuse, is giving license to a kind of a view of history, of the student movement, of the anti-war movement, that kind of valorizes it as this sort of, the new kind of what revolution looks like under these new circumstances. And I think that Marcuse disappoints a lot of these people, ultimately, by actually saying, well, in the final analysis, right, ultimately, as Jeremy said, kind of paraphrasing him, I can't imagine a revolution that doesn't come from the working class, right?
I think that, your essay does a good job, a really good job of sort of rehabilitating kind of this materialist analysis of Marcuse that is often overlooked. And as you've been talking about, how he really does still kind of put an emphasis on the working class as an agent of social change. But part of your essay is also about how the New Left kind of overlooks that. And you refer to a specific phrase in your essay, the cultural turn, which I know other thinkers have referred to before. So what is that? What did the New Left, or what did the New Left take from Marcuse that you think is incomplete? And how does that relate to the cultural turn?
Yeah, I mean, I think, one way of thinking about it, I mean, Marcuse generally was like, look, I like what's new about the New Left because it's figuring out a way to develop a radical politics which is adequate to the advanced capitalist world. So in this moment where economic equality seems to be more widespread, and we know from Piketty, like that's true, it was definitely a moment where economic inequality had been like curtailed through the victories of the previous period and through state action. So then in a period where that seemed to be somewhat the case, but there were all these still like deep fundamental issues in society, like Marcuse was like, what I like about New Left is it's like touching on these fundamental deep issues in the society, and it's kind of mobilizing around them. And it feels much less like, the title of the book, one-dimensional. It's like actually politics seems to be like, there seems to be life in it again. Interestingly, the civil rights movement wasn't as much his like point of reference, and this is something maybe we can touch on as we go, but he was very interested in sort of self-conceived revolutionaries in, so the civil rights movement, I think, was maybe a little too reformist in the way it talked for Marcuse, whereas like, Black Power, the student movement, the sort of counterculture, these sorts of things were like proclaiming the need for like a radically new society, revolution. And Marcuse was like, I like this element because they're kind of bringing back these ideas. On the other hand, like they are the danger of this is that they are still like a minority, and the kind of situation of the left, that the problem of it is that there've always been a few, voices in the wilderness who are like, this society is bad. The question is, what kind of mass politics is it possible to organize a mass politics that could change the society? And so Marcuse would kind of, what Ben was saying about sometimes not satisfying his, his adherents, his devotees, was like, he would say, but, there are limits to what we're doing here. Like and he thought maybe he was interested in feminism at one point, I think, as an idea where, women are 50+% of the population. And so like, maybe this is finally some way this can break into mass action. But generally he was like, there's got to be a majority somehow. And the working class seems to be where it's at. And so the New Left attempt to displace that is wrongheaded. Now, I think, on the like cultural turn idea, I think some of these ideas were taken to mean that fundamentally material politics, material analysis, material concerns were less relevant because whatever affluent society or I don't know, maybe because Marx had been wrong or whatever. And so we can just like, if we figure out the right set of like moral concerns, if we figure out the right kind of things to put on our banners, we can organize a kind of complex, many-sided coalition, intersectional, that doesn't really center around a material analysis or material interests, but instead can kind of, be willed into being. And, wouldn't you know, like intellectuals and middle-class people are really good at coming up with ideas and terms. So they seem like they would be at the head of this, and they are like the discursive inventors who will invent a new kind of politics. Again, and that, certainly took off in academia in the 80s and after as kind of people from the New Left went into academia. So I think there was some sense that like Marcuse maybe seemed to be giving permission for that, even as we're trying to say that like Marcuse himself was quite conflicted about this and would never accepted the kind of way in which that stuff was taken as not a limit to be figured out, but instead as like a valorized, like, oh, we figured it out.
I'd just like to add to that, I mean, in the late 60s, so subsequent to the publication of One-Dimensional Man, 1966, 67, 68, this is kind of the height of this. Marcuse really embraces, in a full-throated way, the counterculture, the kind of the hippie counterculture, as representing something new, something different, a different ethic, a different morality. And it's strange at first blush, given how cynical he seems in One-Dimensional Man about a lot of these kinds of the beats and, a lot of like self-appointed sort of, critics and opponents of, mass society. But he again, always seems to come back to this notion that these groups, the youth, the sort of youth counterculture, have a preparatory function. That's his term. He says that their function is radical enlightenment. It's not quite a political function. It's a sort of an ethico sort of pedagogical one or something, to kind of change the way that people think. And also it's worth just noting, in terms of culture, the cultural turn, One-Dimensional Man is a book largely about ideology. It's largely about how the ideas in our heads, right, living in this advanced industrial society, are tools of the powerful that reconcile us to an unjust order, that obscure real power relations and prevent us from basically achieving freedom. And so there's a whole chapter about language, about the use of words in this society. So I think that, that alone lends itself to an understanding of what needs to change that doesn't actually touch down on the material, even if that is where he ultimately wants us to go.
And a general critique of the New Left and Marcuse was this general bureaucratization of society. And I think, whatever critiques we have the New Left, I think it's fair to say that, there was a good basis for this critique. We've seen, so many, labor parties, socialist parties, trade unions go through this process, lose touch with their base and kind of decline from that. But on the other hand, we've seen the last couple of decades, we've seen the failure of horizontalism and trying to exist as a movement, without taking power or without parties or structures. And I think a lot of us have come around to the idea that, we do need some kind of organization, some kind of party. We need to intervene in the state. So, how would you assess the New Left on this question of bureaucracy? What can we take from them for our current context? How should we think about this bureaucratization of society?
I think, and this has been said already here, that the question of democracy being put back on the table is one of the great legacies of the New Left, to raise questions about people's agency, everyday people's ability to intervene in political affairs, and to actually see that question as the basis on which a democratic socialist society should be constructed. I think that's very relevant today, and that is something that we should look back to. But to your question, Paul, I think there's no doubt that there's a sort of allergy to organization that haunts the left, especially over the last 50, 60 years. And, I think Marcuse's book, if you were looking for quotations to kind of support that, you could find them. He talks at one point about the Italian Communist Party, I believe it is, Jeremy, playing the parliamentary game, and a kind of just profound sort of nihilism about mass politics and the sort of forms that it has taken in advanced industrial society. I think that one of the issues we're trying to look at in the book is how Marcuse is beholden to a notion that he gets from much of the classical Marxist tradition of revolution as a total rupture with the past, with what has been, that I think doesn't allow him to see some of the ways in which existing parties, existing political formations can be avenues for meaningful social change that will empower the working class. I think that the legacy of the New Left often is consonant with that oversight. That's something that certainly today, I think many leftists, from what I have observed, seem to be acknowledging and kind of pulling back from. Jeremy, maybe you want to add to that.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think I agree with most of everything Ben said. I think it's a really, the New Left, even in the Marxist tradition, I think with the rise of the USSR and sort of the centrality of the notion of planning to a conception of Marxism, I think the idea of democracy had really been somewhat overshadowed as a core value of the left. And, it was for Marx, it was and so the New Left, I think, rediscovered that. I do think Marcuse several times said to the students, but you need to be organized. That democracy, somehow a sense of meaningful democracy and a sense of legitimate authority could work together. And, he was pretty skeptical about the sort of totally anti-authority trend that you could see in big parts of the New Left. And, it's complicated. SDS was a really big organization. We sometimes forget that the New Left did actually have this great organization. And honestly, I think one of, it gets me angry to no end that the Weathermen have this kind of weird mystique and positive valuation, because it's they destroyed SDS, and SDS was a huge organization. And whatever pathologies it had, and it had plenty, decentralized, maybe quite a lot, it was a real organization that could do some things on the left that, some people on a whim sort of destroyed. So, they bear a lot of responsibility. But that said, it wasn't an organization a la a union or a political party that was really sort of able to, in a coordinated way, focus its strength win it wasn't even really trying to win elected office or intervene in kind of mainstream social institutions to push them to the left. It wasn't, that close to the labor movement. So these sorts of things, I think, like, Marcuse's sense that there was this strain in the New Left that basically said, like, legitimate authority is impossible, flat hierarchy is the only way to go. And I think my own feeling is, I don't know exactly what flipped the switch, but since Occupy, I feel like the left has been a lot better about this. Like, that's something, there's this just, people have a sense that, like, organization matters, and building relationships, organizing relationships over the long term, and organizations that can pull people through, like, the downtimes in political struggle, and not just when things are really exciting and popping off, that these are now, like, kind of emerging values on the left, which people don't see as anymore, I think, or much less so see as, like, incompatible with a robust idea of democracy. And that, for me, is one of the exciting parts of the Bernie left, or the Jacobin left.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.